Cupertino, California. April 10th, 1985. It was a Wednesday. Outside, the valley was beginning to warm into spring. Inside Building 6 at Apple Computer, the air was cold. Apple was 10 years old. It had already done something almost no one in American business history had managed. It had turned a garage into a revolution. It had put personal computing on the map. It had run a Super Bowl ad that people still talked about. It had made the cover of every magazine worth reading. And its co-founder, Steve Jobs, the 30-year-old visionary at the center of it all, was sitting at that table, waiting. He had called this meeting himself. He believed he was about to take control of the company. He was wrong. What happened in that room over the next several hours would not become fully public for years. But the outcome, stripped of the mythology, stripped of the Silicon Valley hagiography, was this. Steve Jobs, co-founder of Apple Computer, was removed from power at his own company. Unanimously. By a board he had assembled, by colleagues he had recruited, and, in the end, by a CEO he himself had hired. To understand how it all collapsed, you have to first understand how extraordinary the ascent was. Apple Computer was incorporated in 1977. By 1980, its IPO generated more capital than any U.S. company since Ford Motor in 1956. The Apple II became a genuine phenomenon, reliable, practical, and, for the era, affordable. Schools bought them, businesses bought them, families bought them, revenue grew year after year. The culture of Silicon Valley, in many ways, was being invented in real time by the people inside those walls. And at the center of all of it, charismatic, abrasive, visionary, volatile, was Steve Jobs. He was not the engineer. Steve Wozniak was the engineer. Jobs was something harder to define. He was the one who looked at a prototype and decided it wasn't good enough. The one who walked into a room and made people believe that whatever they were building was going to change everything. He was also the one who, on a bad day, could reduce a grown engineer to tears in an elevator. This is a man who had what insiders called a reality distortion field, a term borrowed from a Star Trek episode. It described his ability to convince people that the impossible was merely difficult, that deadlines were negotiable if you just worked hard enough, that Apple's next product would, with absolute certainty, change the world. For years it worked. Then, gradually, it didn't. The Macintosh launch was, by any aesthetic measure, a triumph. Jobs had poured his identity into this machine. It was the product he had built in opposition to the establishment, even the Apple establishment, which had moved on to other priorities. The press loved it. The public was intrigued. Time magazine called it the machine of the year. Then people actually tried to use it. The Macintosh 128K shipped at $2,495, roughly $7,500 in today's money. It was slow. It had no hard drive. Its operating system was elegant, but the software ecosystem barely existed. Professional users, the ones companies actually needed to sell to, had no serious applications to run on it. Internal sales targets were ambitious to the point of fantasy. The Mac division hit approximately 10% of its projected forecast. 10%. Inventory piled up. The Apple II, the machine Jobs had largely dismissed, was still carrying the company's finances. The institutional tension between the Mac group and the Apple II group had become corrosive. Jobs ran his division like a separate kingdom within Apple. He gave his team the best offices, the best perks. He flew a pirate flag above the Mac building, a symbol of defiance. To people in other divisions, it looked less like inspiration and more like contempt. Jobs had recruited John Sculley himself. Sculley was president of Pepsi-Cola. He was everything Jobs was not: process-oriented, measured, politically skilled. Jobs believed they would be partners, peers, that Sculley would handle the business side while Jobs drove the vision. He was wrong about that too. That line has become legend. And it worked. Sculley took the job, but the mythology surrounding the quote obscures something important. Sculley was not Jobs' subordinate. He was hired as CEO. Steve Jobs held the title of chairman of the board. The hierarchy was clear. Jobs simply chose not to acknowledge it. As the Mac numbers disappointed, the two men began to diverge. Jobs pushed for price cuts and aggressive new products. Sculley prioritized profitability and operational discipline. Apple's board, watching the first quarterly loss in the company's history emerge in early 1985, sided with the CEO. Slowly, without any single dramatic rupture, the ground began to shift beneath Jobs. By spring of 1985, Jobs had concluded that John Sculley had to go. He was not subtle about it. He made his case to board members individually. He questioned Sculley's ability. He questioned his understanding of technology, of vision, of what Apple was supposed to be. What Jobs did not anticipate was that Sculley was doing the same thing. Quietly, more methodically. Jobs attempted to organize a formal coup, a maneuver to have Sculley removed from the CEO role. Marcula listened. He took the concern seriously. Then he went to Sculley. The insurrection, such as it was, had lasted approximately 24 hours before it collapsed. What happened next is remarkable for how institutional it was. This was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a board decision, executed with corporate precision. The meeting on April 10th ran for hours. By the end of April 11th, the board had reached its decision. John Sculley delivered an ultimatum. It was not ambiguous. The board backed Sculley. Unanimously. Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, was removed from his role as executive vice president and head of the Macintosh division. He was offered the title of chairman, a position that sounded significant and meant nothing. A desk, a title, and the understanding that he was no longer wanted. History, inevitably, produces competing versions of this moment. Sculley's account suggests that the board should have mediated more carefully. Jobs, for his part, was not reflective. Andy Hertzfeld described the aftermath as watching a man in free fall. Jobs made phone calls. He argued. He tried to reassemble support. It was too late. There is a question that every account of this period circles without quite answering. Was the board's decision an act of institutional pragmatism or a failure of imagination? Both things can be true. On May 31, 1985, Apple made it official. A press announcement confirmed Jobs' removal from management duties. The timing was not coincidental. The press understood what had happened. So did the industry. Jobs arrived at the office in the days that followed. He had nothing to do. He would later describe those weeks as some of the darkest of his life. The reality distortion field, it turned out, had limits. On September 16, 1985, Steve Jobs resigned from Apple entirely. He took 5 senior engineers with him. Jobs sold almost all of his Apple shares. He founded NeXT Inc. NeXT attracted serious talent and serious funding. And slowly, he began to rebuild something. Apple without Jobs was, to put it plainly, less than Apple with him. By the early 1990s, Apple had lost its cultural positioning. Sculley himself was pushed out in 1993. By 1996, Apple had lost nearly 80% of its market share. That was the state of Apple when its board began negotiations to acquire NeXT. The deal closed in December 1996. The price, $429 million. Steve Jobs came home. What followed Jobs' return to Apple is among the most documented corporate reversals in business. History. The iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, a market capitalization that would eventually make Apple the most valuable company in the world. Next step, the operating system Jobs had built in his years away became the technical foundation of Mac OS. The exile had not been wasted time. But consider what the decade of exile actually cost. Consider the products Apple did not build, the directions it did not pursue, the cultural authority It ceded to Microsoft in the years when Windows became the operating system of the world. The question is not whether Apple survived. It did. The question is what might have been, and at what price the interim came. The reckoning. Was the board right? This is the question at the center of everything. The conventional reading, shaped heavily by Jobs' later success, is that the board made a catastrophic error, that they chose stability over vision and paid a decade-long price for it. There is another reading. The Steve Jobs of 1985 was not the Steve Jobs of 1997. He was brilliant and charismatic and uncompromising. He was also, by the accounts of nearly everyone who worked for him in that period, genuinely difficult to work with in ways that were eroding the institution around him. The Mac had failed commercially. He had attempted a political coup against his own CEO. He had created a culture within his division that alienated colleagues across the company. A board charged with protecting a public company had, perhaps, reasonable grounds for the decision they made. What they could not have known was that the 12 years Jobs would spend outside Apple were not a defeat. They were an education. At Pixar, which he acquired and shepherded to extraordinary success, he learned patience. He learned to let other talented people lead. He learned that a great organization was not one man's will. Extended outward, it was a culture, a set of values, a shared belief in the work. He returned to Apple a different person. Not softer, exactly, but more precise. Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. He meant it. But notice what that sentence requires. You have to lose everything to understand it. The story of 1985 is not, finally, a story about Steve Jobs. It's a story about what happens when a founder's vision outpaces the institution's capacity to contain it. It's a story about boards that are charged with governance, but are rarely equipped to manage genius. About the way companies are structured to reward predictability and punish the kind of disruption that ultimately saves them. It's a story about ego, and about how ego and vision, in the extraordinary cases, are nearly indistinguishable until one of them destroys the other. The numbers tell one story. The more important story, the one that matters beyond the valuations and the timelines, is about what happens to a person when the institution they built decides it no longer needs them, and what that person chooses to do next. There is a version of this story where April 10, 1985, is simply a date on a corporate timeline. We don't think that's the right version. Every person watching this has had a moment, or will have one, where something they built, or earned, or believed in, was taken from them, or ended, or changed beyond recognition. The question isn't whether that moment comes. It does. The question is what you call it afterward. The board voted Jobs out. Jobs called it his pivot point.